Hello there, sixth graders. We are going to be reading chapter 12.3, Citizens of the World, explore sections 4 through 6 today. And I will be sharing with you the notes that we'll be doing today with our reading. So you can follow along and read along with me, highlighting what's important, and then following along with filling in your notes on chapter 12.3, explore sections 4 through 6. And although the essential question is the same, has global contact and migration created a more culturally united or divided world? The topic that you're going to be reading about is the history behind migration. So, technological advances made throughout history that made migration easier, and then cultural diffusion and what that is. So, please open to your social studies textbook, explore section 4, and it should look like this. And then you're going to also go to your notes. Okay. So, again, you can see there is our essential question, and we're only reading explore section 4, 5, and 6. So there is no summary. This is part 2 of our notes. We will be reading chapter 12.3, sections 7 through 9 next week. Okay. So again, we always want to set a purpose for our reading before we actually start reading. And the explore section 4 is about more and more mobility. Mobility means movement. So we need to find 2 key facts about early human migration. What kind of technological advances have made migration easier in regards to ancient road systems? What kind of technological advances have made migration easier? New travel routes. And then what kind of technological advances have made migration easier in regards to trains, planes, and automobiles? So we're going to go ahead and go to our reading of chapter 12.3, explore section 4. Remember to highlight as you are following along. You can always stop the video and pause and then do what you need to do and then come back to it. So more and more mobility. What kinds of technological advances have made migration easier? We're going to skip the chart. When the earliest human beings began migrating and settling around the world, they traveled by foot. According to what scientists have figured out, humans began migrating out of Africa about 80,000 years ago. We do not know exactly why they left. Some people believe that climate change may have made other lands more livable. New advances such as making fires may have allowed humans to travel more easily. Some settled in Asia and Australia. Years later, others found their way to Europe and to the Americas. It is possible that they crossed land bridges between the continents that no longer exist. Whatever their reasons and wherever they wound up, these early humans definitely traveled a long way to find a place to call home. So we know that early migration was by foot, okay? We know human migration started about 80,000 years ago. Okay, we know that we believe climate change may have been one of the reasons for migration, and then making fires made it easier for humans to travel more easily. Okay, and then it is possible they crossed land bridges between the continents that no longer exist because of movement. Oops, sorry. Okay. The continents moving, I'm sorry. Ancient road systems. Over time, migration has become easier. Thanks to advances in transportation, human migration is not nearly as difficult as it was 80,000 years ago. One of the earliest advances in transportation was the road system. One of the first known long-distance road system was the Silk Road through ancient China, India, and Persia. The Silk Road was a series of connected trade routes. It connected Chinese merchants with Central Asia and the Middle East and Europe. Altogether, the system was about 4,000 miles long. People traveled it by foot, camel, donkey, or cart. Okay, I think that's important. Another important early road system was in the Roman Empire. This road system covered much of Western Europe and Northern Africa. It stretched more than 50,000 miles. The road was straight, well drained, and paved. The pavement was made of packed stone or concrete. The roads were built mainly for Rome's military. However, they wound up being useful for the migration of people and cultures. So Roman roads were made so well that they still exist today. Pioneering new travel routes. Advances made during the Age of Exploration helped with migration as well. Beginning around the 1400s, European sailors began searching for trade routes to Asia. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. As they sailed farther and farther from home, they learned to navigate across the ocean. Over the years, they developed new navigation tools. They increased their knowledge of sailing routes. They drew more accurate maps. These advances made it easier for groups to migrate to North and South America. All very important. In the 1600s, European colonists began to move to North America. Years later, long overland trails such as the Wilderness Road helped them migrate even deeper into the continent. I'm going to highlight that. In the late 1700s, the Wilderness Road was the main route that settlers took to travel west across the Appalachian Mountains. Today, about 43 million Americans can trace their families to people who use this famous trail. All right. Trains, planes, and automobiles. More advances were introduced during the Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s and early 1800s. These continued to help people migrate. Okay. The Industrial Revolution was a period when new machines changed manufacturing processes. Coal started being used to power steam engines. The steam locomotive and the steamship could carry large loads across long distances. This included over land and sea. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that because coal and power steam engines were very critical in the steam locomotive and the steamship, which could carry loads across long distances. That's important. In 1869, the United States completed the first transcontinental railroad. This railroad would carry goods and people across the country. That's important. In 1903, the Wright brothers made the first successful flight of the powered aircraft. This historic event took place in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Okay, so let's highlight that. At about the same time, the automobile started to replace the horse and wagon on city streets. The United States and other countries built longer and better roads and highways. The automobile became the most popular and important choice for transportation. This is especially true in the United States. Today, people have many different transportation choices. People can travel by high-speed trains for crossing continents, or they can choose jet airplanes for traveling across oceans. Lots of choices available for us today, guys. Okay, so let's go to our notes. And let's go ahead and start filling in our 2-column notes. So 2 key facts about early migration. People traveled by foot, and they were not able to travel long distances. What kind of technological advances have made migration easier in regards to ancient road systems? One of the first known long-distance road systems was the Silk Road through ancient China, India, and Persia. People traveled it by foot, camel, donkey, or cart. Another important early road system was the Roman Empire. The pavement was made of packed stone or concrete. The roads were built mainly for Rome's military. However, they wound up being useful for the migration of people and cultures. And it allowed for them to trade with other places. What technological advances have made migration easier in terms of new travel routes? Beginning around the 1400s, European sailors began searching for trade routes to Asia. Over the years, they developed new navigation tools. They increased their knowledge of sailing routes. They drew more accurate maps. Long overland trails, such as the Wilderness Trail, helped them migrate even deeper into the continent. So, if you can imagine, we can compare this type of advancement to us having digital or online based, Wi Fi based GPS systems, satellite based, I should say. What kinds of technological advances have made migration easier? Trains, planes, automobiles. The Industrial Revolution was a period when new machines changed manufacturing processes. Coal started being used to power steam engines. The steam locomotive and the steamship could carry large loads across long distances. In 1869, the United States completed the first transcontinental railroad. In 1903, the Wright brothers made the first successful flight of a powered aircraft. The automobile started to replace the horse and wagon on city streets. The United States and other countries built longer and better roads and highways. People can travel by high-speed trains for crossing continents, or they can choose jet airplanes for traveling across oceans. Okay, guys, so that should be in your notes for section 4. And we're going to move on to section 5, which is about changing the local environment. So we're going to be looking at how human migration affects the landscape and demographics of a nation, specifically America or the United States. How does human migration affect the landscape and demographics of a nation in terms of Asia or the Mongol Empire a long time ago? And how does human migration affect the landscape and demographics of a nation in regards to Jewish land and population? So that's Explore Section 5. So let's go back to our tech book, and move on to Explore Section 5. Changing the local environment. How does human migration affect the landscape and demographics of a region? Okay, so some important words are migration, landscape, and demographics. Okay, the last 500 years of human history have seen an amazing amount of human migration. During that time, Europe colonized much of the world. Colonizing an area means that another country has control of the region's natural resources and people. I'm going to highlight that. Millions of Africans, were kidnapped and shipped around the globe as enslaved people. Millions of immigrants made homes for themselves in new countries. The world we see around us today is a result of the migrations of the last 5 centuries. Mass movements of people changed the physical environment. They also changed the makeup of the human population. So we know that I'm going to highlight this in blue. Here's a reason why things changed. So people who migrated, okay, mass movement of people changes the physical environment and changes the human population. Transforming America. European colonists began migrating to North America in the late 1400s and early 1500s. They called this region the New World. They brought with them tools and weapons that were unfamiliar to Native people. They brought ideas about owning property that the Native peoples did not share. Colonists brought new diseases. The new tools and weapons changed patterns and traditional behaviors. The new diseases often killed the native populations. So that was a negative effect of migration. While the numbers of Native Americans rapidly decreased, there was a steady increase in the number of European people living in the Americas. The Europeans also changed the land itself. The Great Plains, for example, was originally a large flat area of grasslands in the US Midwest. That's where we live. Native Americans lived there. Herds of bison roamed the land. Around 1870, European settlers began to arrive in large numbers. The Transcontinental Railroad and advances in farming encouraged settlement. By 1910, more than half of the population in the Great Plains was of European descent. The new citizens set up large farms and ranches where grasslands had been. So there's an example of how they changed the physical environment. Towns emerged around railroad stops. These towns had hotels, restaurants, and other businesses. Bison were hunted for their hides or skins. These hides could be shipped cheaply to markets in the East by railroad. By 1883, the bison were mostly wiped out. The Native American nations of the Great Plains also suffered greatly. They were forced into involuntary migration. We remember involuntary migration from part one of our notes. When people are forced to leave where they live, the US government made them leave their traditional lands. The government moved them to large areas of public lands called reservations. Many Native American groups still live on reservations today. Okay, so you guys can see how they changed the landscape. Okay, bison were hunted, and they were wiped out pretty much. Oops. The Native Americans, okay, let me see here if I can do it this way. There we go. Native Americans were forced into involuntary migration. In later US history, there would be the Great Migration of African Americans. Between 1915 and 1970, more than 6 million African Americans moved from the South to cities in the Northeast and Midwest. This affected the population of northern cities such as Chicago, Illinois. Before 1950, only about 2% of the population of Chicago was African American. As a result of the Great Migration, Chicago's African American population rose to about 33% by 1970. Okay, so I'm going to highlight this, and then I'm going to highlight this last sentence. Mongol conquests. Human migration is not limited to the United States or to recent centuries. For example, during the 1200s and 1300s, the Mongol Empire stretched across almost all of Asia. The Mongol troops moved through Asia, conquering new regions. The Mongols had a lot of contact with the people of the regions. There was a lot of cultural and economic exchange. However, the military battles were fierce and bloody. Some scholars estimate that around 30 million people died because of the Mongol attacks. There was also famine and disease that followed. So you guys can see how that changed culture and environment. Centuries of Jewish migration. The world's Jewish population has experienced several major migrations throughout history. These have affected the Jewish population in different regions. Okay. Ooh. The Jews' original homeland was in present-day Israel. In the late 500s BCE, the Babylonians conquered Judea, one of the Jewish kingdoms in Israel. Large numbers of Jews were forced to migrate to Babylon. This was the start of what is called the Jewish diaspora. This diaspora refers to the dispersal of Jews to other parts of the world. By the 100 CE, some 5 million Jews lived outside of Israel. At that time, Israel had come under Roman rule. So I'm going to highlight this, it's important. Over the next centuries, the diaspora continued. Large numbers of Jews migrated to Spain, France, and Germany. After being forced out of Spain in 1492, Jews began settling in North Africa, Turkey, and Greece. Many Jews in Western European countries like Germany and France also faced violence. During the Middle Ages, many Jews from those countries moved to Poland and Russia. Then, in the 1930s, the Nazis took control over Germany. They invaded other parts of Europe and began killing millions of Jews. Those who were able to move to other countries, including the United States. So we know that this was a huge part of our history. Both during World War II and after, many Jews migrated to Israel. Okay, so today more Jews live in Israel than anywhere else. The United States is a close second. There are also large Jewish populations in France, Canada, and the United Kingdom. All right. So there's a video about Jewish immigrants settling in Israel. Okay. Let's go back to our notes. All right. So for Explore Section 5, how does human migration affect the landscape of demographics of a nation? So your answers will vary for Explore Section 5, but what you should include is what was highlighted. So in the United States or America, we saw colonists from Europe moving to America. They also took away land from Native Americans and sent them to reservations. They also used or developed places in the Midwest near the transcontinental railroads. They developed cities with hotels and things like that. So they changed the demographics of the nation and the landscape. And what happened in the Midwest with the bison, hunting bison and selling bison, we know that the grasslands went away and the bison population went away. How does human migration affect the landscape and demographics from the Asian Mongol Empire? We know that the Mongol Empire was very powerful and they were violent. So they traveled across most of Asia, conquering new areas, and they killed many people in their conquests, which definitely changed the demographics or the population of those areas. And then finally, how does human migration affect the landscape and demographics of a nation in terms of Jewish land and population? So we know that for thousands of years, the Jewish culture and people had changed because of forced migration. It was an involuntary migration. They were forced out of Israel to other parts of Europe and then parts of Africa. And then there was a movement of people who came or Jews who came to settle back in Israel. So your answers will vary there depending on what you highlighted, and you can add that there. Okay, explore section 6. Our last section is about migration and cultural diffusion. So we're going to define cultural diffusion. We're going to look at how human migration creates cultural change in regards to Islam. How does human migration create cultural change in the age of enlightenment? And how does human migration create cultural change in indigenous languages, the languages of native people? Okay, so those are the things we're going to be looking for in Explore Section 6. Okay, so now went to the next page. Explore Section 6 is about migration and cultural diffusion. How does human migration create cultural changes? When humans migrate to new regions, they bring their ideas, beliefs, and customs. As a result, human migration results in cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is what happens when different cultures mix. They influence each other. Ideas and customs spread. They are borrowed by people from other cultures. Language, religion, and art are all part of this cultural diffusion. Foods, clothing styles, and social beliefs can also can spread and be borrowed. Okay. The spread of Islam, one of the major religions in the world, is an example of cultural diffusion. The spread of both religions are examples of cultural diffusion. The Prophet Muhammad founded Islam. This happened in the Arabian city of Mecca in early 600 CE. Soon afterward, his followers, Muslims, began spreading their religion locally. When Islamic rulers conquered new lands, they brought their religion with them. Before long, an Arab Muslim empire stretched across parts of Europe. It then spread through Central Asia. Muslim traders extended the influence of Islam throughout India, China, and Indonesia. Over time, many cultures and civilizations adopted Islamic beliefs. Today, there are more than 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. They live in nearly every corner of the planet. The spread of ideas from the Enlightenment is another example of cultural diffusion. The Enlightenment was a movement started by great thinkers in Europe in the 16 and 1700s. During this time, philosophers, scientists, and artists explored the world in new ways. They no longer looked to religious authority for answers to questions. Religion was a very strong influence in during that time period, which we called the Middle Ages. Sorry, I guess I'm not sure why my highlight feature isn't working. They started looking for new explanations for things. The ideas of the Enlightenment spread into the political, artistic, and scientific understandings of the day. People in Europe shared these ideas through books and conversation. The ideas of the Enlightenment spread to France, Italy, and other parts of Europe. They spread as far as Britain's American colonies. The US Constitution is a product of Enlightenment thinking. Okay. Migration and cultural diffusion can also have a negative impact on some cultures. As new beliefs, practices, and language become common, older traditions can be crowded out. Language professors are worried that many indigenous languages are dying as popular languages such as English, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and Hindi become more common around the world. Researchers are working with elders in several smaller indigenous communities around the world to preserve languages such as Amerdag in northern Australia and Yuchi in southwestern United States. Okay, so researchers are working with elders to preserve languages. Okay. All right, so let's go back to our notes. Again, if you are following along and highlighting, you can add what you highlighted to your notes where it says answers may vary. So define cultural diffusion. It's really important that you know the definition of cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is what happens when different cultures mix. They influence each other, ideas and customs spread, they are borrowed by people from other cultures, language, religion, and art are all part of this cultural diffusion. Foods, clothing styles, and social beliefs also can spread and be borrowed. So in terms of how does human migration, how did it create cultural change in the world of Islam? And we know that Muslims traveled and shared their cultural beliefs and their religion. Therefore, there's millions of Muslims in the world today. In the age of enlightenment, people like scientists, artists, philosophers, they didn't just rely on religious beliefs. They also started to explore new ideas in the world, and they brought those ideas with them to parts of the new world, like the American colonies. And therefore, the ideas of enlightenment did influence important government changes like the writing of the US Constitution in America. And then finally, how does human migration create cultural change? When people move to different parts of the world, they bring their native languages with them. So some native languages like English, Chinese, those languages that are global languages where many people speak them are crowding out those old languages that people aren't speaking anymore. So we have researchers who are working with people, elderly people in those countries to make sure those languages are still spoken. So you can have any of the information we highlighted in the text to add to these spaces here. So please do not write answers will vary. That means that your answers could vary based on what you highlighted in the text. So you're going to copy and paste what you highlighted and add that here. Okay? All right. So the answers will vary just tells us, the teacher, when we're checking your notes, that you might have different answers based on what you read from the text and highlighted. Okay, everyone, so now we've read chapter 12.3, sections 4 through 6 about early human migration.